The walls did not crack, they did not crumble, they fell flat, and the city that had stood for thousands of years was open to the sky. No siege, no battering rams, no army scaling the stones. Just a march, a blast of horns, a shout, and then nothing between the people outside and the people inside but rubble. That moment has been retold for more than 3,000 years. It has been sung in spirituals, painted on cathedral walls, and argued over in dig reports. And the strangest part is this: we still do not fully agree on what happened there, or when, or how. The story and the ground do not line up neatly, but they both point to the same place. A city that fell, a gate that opened, and a name that never disappeared. That moment, whether you read it as history or as one of the most enduring stories ever told, has never left us. It lives in song, in sermon, and in the dirt under the feet of archaeologists who still argue over what really happened at the place we call Jericho. But before we get to what the ground says, you need to understand why that story still cuts. Why one city's fall has outlasted empires. Why the image of walls coming down without a single weapon has never lost its power. There is a reason the first battle in the conquest is not a battle at all. It is a ritual, a silence, and then a collapse. And that reason goes to the heart of how the story was meant to be heard. The story begins across the river. A people on the move, a new leader named Joshua, and a city that had to fall first. Jericho was the gate. Whoever held it controlled the pass into the highlands. It was one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world. Its walls had seen empires rise and fall. The king knew what was at stake. So the gates closed, the walls were manned, the city sealed. No one in, no one out, or so they thought. And the account handed down in the book of Joshua says something happened next that would define the conquest before a single sword was raised. Something that would turn the fate of one woman and her family into a thread that runs through the rest of the narrative. 2 spies went in. They needed a place to hide. They found it in the house of a woman named Rahab. The text calls her a prostitute. It also makes her the one who chooses. When the king's men came for them, she did not hand them over. She hid them under flax on the roof. She lied to the authorities. She bet her life on the people outside the walls. And in doing so, she became the only named survivor of the city besides Joshua himself in the narrative. When the end came, that decision would matter more than any wall. She had already decided which side would win. In return for her life and her family's, she was told to mark her house. A red cord in the window, nothing more. That cord would be the only exception when the end came. What happened to everyone else inside those walls would not touch her. The text is clear about that. The text is also clear about what came next. After the Israelites crossed the Jordan, the command was not to attack, it was to march once around the walls, in silence. No battle cry. No assault. Just the Ark of the Covenant, the priests with their horns, and the sound of feet. They did it for 6 days, 1 circuit per Galtani. The people inside could only watch and wait. Imagine standing on those walls, seeing the same procession every morning. No explanation, no demand for surrender. Just silence and movement. The psychological weight of that repetition is part of the story. Something was being built, or broken, day by day. The tension in that silence is the point. Something was being withheld. Something worse was coming. At the time, no one behind those walls could have known that the 7th day would not look like the first 6. That the ritual would shift. That the end would come not with a siege engine but with a shout. On the 7th day they did not march once. They marched 7 times. The number 7 runs through the whole account. 7 priests, 7 horns, 7 circuits on the final day. Then the horns blew, the people shouted, and according to the narrative, the walls fell not inward as they might from a battering ram. The text says they fell flat. The city was laid open. Excavations at es-Sultan have in fact found evidence of walls that collapsed outward in some destruction layers, unusual for a typical military assault, where force from outside usually drives walls inward. That detail does not prove the biblical account, but it is one of the few physical details that aligns with the way the fall is described. Not from rams, not from siege, they fell. The city was put to the sword under the strict terms of the text. Only Rahab and those in her house were brought out. She and her family were folded into Israel. The rest was destruction. The narrative allows no plunder, no quarter, only the house with the red cord. Joshua is said to have cursed anyone who rebuilt the city's foundations and gates. That curse would be remembered for centuries. The Bible later records that a man named Heel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho under King Ahab, and the curse was said to have been fulfilled in the deaths of his sons. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not for the city and not for the way we would tell it. It was only the beginning of what we would still be arguing about 3,000 years later. If you're drawn to stories like this, where faith, power, and one city collide, like this video and subscribe. We go deep on the events that shaped the world every week. What was Jericho? In the ground. The story lives in a book. The city lives under a mound. In 1868, Charles Warren identified a mound west of the Jordan as the site of biblical Jericho. Today we call it Tel es-Sultan. That identification has held. Archaeologists do not dispute it. The location is not the problem. The problem is time. When did the walls fall? And does the destruction we find in the dirt match the one we read in the text? The answers have divided scholars for over a century. Excavations have been going on there for over a century, and they have found a city that was destroyed violently. Burned grain. Collapsed mud brick, evidence of fire and abandonment. In the 1930s, John Garstang uncovered a network of collapsed walls and dated the destruction to around 1400 BCE. 2 decades later, Kathleen Kenyon re-excavated the site. She argued the destruction was earlier in the 16th or 15th century, and that by the time usually assigned to Joshua, the Tel was largely unoccupied. Radiocarbon work in the 1990s pointed to a late 17th or 16th century destruction. So we have Garstang's 1400, Kenyon's 1550 or 1580, and carbon dates that lean toward the 16th. The debate over the exact century has never fully closed. Historians who place the Israelite emergence in the 13th century are left with a gap. If Jericho was destroyed in the 16th, who did it? Some point to Egyptian campaigns. Kenyon herself linked the destruction to the expulsion of the Hyksos. The puzzle is still open. Some scholars still argue for a later destruction layer that could align with the biblical timeline. Recent work by the Italian-Palestinian expedition has suggested late Bronze occupation at the site, with a mud brick wall and a structure known as the Middle Building that appears to have been destroyed and later reused. So the picture is still shifting. At the same time, many historians and archaeologists argue that the Book of Joshua was written much later than the events it describes, perhaps in the 7th or 6th century BCE under the Kingdom of Judah, and that the conquest narrative served a political and theological purpose, to justify claims to the land and to judge the nation by its loyalty to the covenant. In that reading, the fall of Jericho is not a blow-by-blow report. It is memory, identity, and ideology woven together. What is not in dispute is that Tel es-Sultan was a fortified city, that it was destroyed, and that the manner of that destruction, including walls that in some layers appear to have collapsed outward, which is unusual for a typical military assault, remains a subject of study. Ernst Sellen and Karl Watzinger excavated there in 1907 and 1911. They found 2 walls. They first thought it supported the biblical account. Then they revised their dating to the Middle Bronze Age. The story of Jericho's archaeology is full of those revisions. Each generation of diggers has refined or overturned what the last one claimed. The city keeps its secrets. We keep digging. So we are left with 2 things. A story that has shaped cultures and armies and art for millennia, and a mound of earth where a real city once stood, was shattered, and was abandoned. The gap between the two is where history and memory meet. The fall of Jericho in the text is the first victory of the conquest, a sign that the land would open. In the ground, it is one more destroyed Bronze Age city, with a name we still know because the name never died. What happened next changed everything for the people who told the story, but the stones do not tell it the same way the scrolls do. And that tension between the word and the dirt is part of why we still care. We are not done with Jericho. Every few years a new excavation or a new study refines the date, reopens the debate, or finds another layer in the tell. The city keeps giving up fragments, and we keep trying to fit them into the story we have always known. That is the work of history. Not to replace the story with a single answer, but to stand in the gap between what was told and what was buried, and to hold both in view. The walls came down. The story did not. And somewhere between the tell and the text, Jericho still stands, still falling, still remembered. Every time we tell it, we look again. That is the price of a story that will not stay in the past. If this kind of deep dive into the past keeps you watching, like the video and subscribe for more. We unpack the events that built the world, one story at a time. The walls came down, however they came down, whether in a day or over years, whether in the way the tradition says or in ways we are still piecing together. A city that had stood at the threshold of the land was gone. The conquest would continue, other cities would fall, but none would be remembered like this one. And the story of that fall, the march, the silence, the shout, the cord in the window has outlasted the stones. It has outlasted the kingdoms that fought over the land. It has outlasted the empires that came after. Rahab's name is still spoken. Joshua's curse is still read, and the image of walls falling flat without a single blow still carries a charge. We are still standing at that gap, still asking what fell and when and why we never stopped telling it. You look at the landscape and you see that the city is nothing but dust and rubble. But the story is not.